The Meridian Suite at Aurelia was not a room. It was a statement. Its walls were paneled in dark, lustrous mahogany that seemed to drink the light, leaving only soft, strategic pools of illumination on the vast, circular table at its center. Each of the 12 high-backed chairs was upholstered in deep crimson velvet, and the single, magnificent chandelier hanging above was a cascade of hand-blown Venetian glass, each teardrop catching the light like a frozen star. The air itself felt curated, heavy with the scent of money, ambition, and the faint, floral notes of $1,000 centerpiece. Tonight, this silent theater of power belonged to Alistair Finch. He sat at the head of the table, a position he occupied not just by geography but by divine right. His suit was Seville Row, his watch was a Patek Philippe, and his confidence was so absolute it was practically an architectural feature of the room. His guests, a collection of investors and senior partners, orbited him like nervous moons, their laughter a fraction too loud, their agreement a shade too quick. At the other end of this solar system, seated to Finch's right, was the reason for this entire performance. Sheikh Khalid. He was a man of quiet presence, his traditional robes a stark, elegant contrast to the dark suits surrounding him. He was the potential investor, the silent vessel of billions of dollars that Finch intended to secure by the time dessert was served. Yet, for all the deference shown to his wealth, the man himself was treated as an afterthought. They spoke to his translator, a nervous young man seated just behind him, but mostly they spoke to each other, their words a torrent of financial jargon and self-congratulation that washed over the Sheikh without touching him. And then there was Clara. At 20 years old, she was the least visible person in the most exclusive room in the city. Her uniform was a crisp, black sheath, severe and functional, designed to make her blend into the polished shadows. Her job was to be a ghost, a pair of hands that appeared with a bottle of sparkling water and vanished before a thought could be completed. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, her face a mask of pleasant neutrality. But behind her eyes, she was absorbing everything. The subtle condescension in Finch's tone, the way his partners angled their bodies towards him, the profound, almost regal stillness of Sheikh Khalid, a man adrift in a sea of noise. Clara felt the familiar weight of invisibility settle on her shoulders. It was more than just a professional requirement. It was a state of being. In rooms like this, she was not a person. She was a function, an object, as inanimate as the silver fork she was carefully placing beside a crystal water goblet. The men at the table didn't see a young woman with a history, with thoughts, with a life beyond these walls. They saw a service. And tonight, the weight of that erasure felt heavier than ever, a suffocating silence that mirrored the one surrounding the guest of honor. The first course arrived, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops on a bed of saffron risotto. As Clara served Sheikh Khalid, she moved with the quiet grace her job demanded. Her presence meant to be felt only by the arrival of the plate. The conversation at the table, however, had the subtlety of a jackhammer. Finch was holding court, his voice booming with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been told no. He was explaining the disruptive potential of his new AI-driven logistics platform, using a vocabulary so dense with acronyms and buzzwords that it was almost a parody of itself. His partners nodded along, their faces a mixture of admiration and calculation. They were all playing their parts in Finch's grand drama, and the script was all about him. The Sheikh listened, his expression unreadable. He took a small bite of the scallop, his movements precise and deliberate. He said nothing. The silence from his end of the table grew, becoming a vacuum that the others rushed to fill with more noise, more boasts, more empty words. Clara could feel the dissonance in the room like a low hum. It was a gathering built on a foundation of profound disrespect, papered over with expensive food and feigned courtesy. They didn't want to know Sheikh Khalid. They wanted to acquire him. He was not a partner, he was a prize. As she circled the table to refill water glasses, she caught snippets of their conversation. They talked about his country as a market, a resource, a geopolitical asset. They never once spoke of its people, its culture, or its history. It was a land of sand and oil, a caricature drawn from headlines and stereotypes. Clara felt a dull ache in her chest. She had heard this kind of talk before in other rooms from other men just like these. It was the casual arrogance of the powerful, the blindness of those who see the world only as a map of their own opportunities. She glanced at the Sheikh. His eyes were not on the food, nor on the man speaking. They were scanning the room, taking in the details with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He saw the way the light hit the crystal, the nervous tick of the junior partner sitting opposite him, the almost imperceptible wear on the corner of the velvet chair. He was a man who understood that true power lay not in speaking, but in observing. And in this room full of speakers, he was the only one truly listening. He was listening to the silence, to the subtext, to the vast, empty space between what was being said and what was actually meant. Clara felt a strange kinship with him in that moment. They were the two silent observers in a room deafened by its own ego. The rupture, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion but a small, sharp crack in the polished facade. Marcus, Finch's youngest and most ambitious vice president, decided it was his moment to shine. Eager to impress his boss and perhaps endear himself to their silent guest, he leaned forward with a practiced, charming smile. He thought a little humor might bridge the growing chasm between them. "You know, Sheikh," Marcus began, his voice slick with manufactured bonhomie. "Back in Texas, we say everything's bigger, but I have a feeling your sandboxes are a little bigger than ours," he chuckled, expecting the table to join in. A few of Finch's men offered up tight, obligatory laughs. Finch himself smiled thinly, a silent approval of his protégé's attempt to be relatable. The joke hung in the air, a clumsy, leaden thing. It was a pathetic attempt at connection, reducing a nation's geography and a culture's identity to a childish playground image. It was the kind of casual, thoughtless remark that revealed a universe of ignorance. The forced laughter died away, leaving a silence that was heavier and more uncomfortable than before. Sheikh Khalid did not smile. He did not react at all, save for a subtle tightening around his eyes. He slowly placed his fork down beside his plate, the quiet click of silver against porcelain echoing in the tense quiet. It was a gesture of finality, a full stop at the end of a sentence no one else had the courage to finish. He had been patient. He had been polite. But there was a limit to the indignities a man of his stature would endure, even in the name of business. Clara was standing near the service station, preparing to clear the plates. She saw the whole exchange up close. She saw the light in the Sheikh's eyes dim, replaced by a cool, distant appraisal. He was no longer a potential partner. He was an anthropologist studying a strange and vulgar tribe. The second-hand shame was so acute it made her skin prickle. She felt an urge to apologize for them, for their smugness, for their utter lack of grace. She knew, from a childhood spent in diplomatic circles, that respect was the only true international currency. And Alistair Finch and his team were bankrupt. She watched as Finch, sensing the misstep, quickly tried to pivot, launching into a long-winded anecdote about a successful deal in Singapore, hoping to bury Marcus's blunder under an avalanche of new words. But the damage was done. The air in the room had changed. The delicate crystal of their constructed reality had a hairline fracture, and everyone could feel it. The strained dinner continued, the conversation now painfully stilted. Finch's monologue on his Singaporean triumph eventually wound down, met with a series of muted murmurs. The energy had bled out of the room, leaving behind a residue of awkwardness. Clara began to clear the appetizer plates, her movements calm and deliberate, a small island of order in the sea of social discomfort. As she reached for Sheikh Khalid's plate, her sleeve brushed against the lapel of his robe. For a fleeting moment, her eyes were drawn to a small pin fastened there. It was not a jewel-encrusted display of wealth, like the gaudy tie clips worn by the other men. It was a small, intricately crafted piece of silver, shaped into the likeness of a falcon, its wings outstretched in flight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the details so fine they could only be appreciated up close. It was an object of personal significance, not of public spectacle. It spoke of heritage, of a connection to something ancient and proud. As her gaze lingered on the pin for a fraction of a second too long, the Sheikh's eyes met hers. It was the first time he had looked directly at anyone other than the speaker, the first moment of genuine, unmediated contact he had made all evening. There was no artifice in his look, no calculation. There was only a quiet, weary intelligence. In that brief, silent exchange, Clara felt seen. It was a startling sensation, a sudden reversal of the invisibility she had worn like a second skin. He saw her, a person, not just a function. The moment passed in an instant, but it lingered. It gave her an anchor in the suffocating room. It also stirred a memory, a feeling she hadn't accessed in years. She thought of her father, Robert Vance. He had been a cultural attaché, a diplomat of the old school who believed in building bridges, not walls. He had spent 15 years stationed in Sheikh Khalid's home country. Clara had spent her formative years there, her childhood a vibrant tapestry of new sights, sounds, and languages. Her father had worn a similar pin, a gift from a local elder, a symbol of friendship. He had taught her that to understand a person you had to understand their world, their poetry, their history. Never mistake a man's title for his measure, he used to say. Dignity is the only thing you truly own. That memory, that voice, solidified something in her. It wasn't a plan, not yet. It was a quiet resolve, a deep-seated refusal to be a bystander to this slow, polite execution of respect. She would not let her father's memory be dishonored by the boorishness of men like Finch. She would not stand by and watch a good man be treated like a commodity. The main course was served, roasted lamb with root vegetables, a dish that should have been hearty and welcoming, but in the chilled atmosphere of the Meridian suite, it felt like another prop on a failing stage. The silence at the Sheikh's end of the table had now become absolute. He had not touched his food. He murmured something quietly to his translator. The young translator leaned in, listened, and then turned to the restaurant manager, Julian, who was hovering nearby, his face a mask of professional anxiety. The Sheikh, the translator began, his voice hesitant. He has a question about the spices used in the lamb's preparation. He has a sensitivity. Julian's smile became rigid. Of course, the chef uses a blend of rosemary, thyme, and a touch of garlic. It is our signature seasoning. The translator relayed this information. The Sheikh shook his head slightly and spoke again, his tone quiet but firm. The translator turned back to Julian, looking even more flustered. He says it is not those herbs. It is something else. A seed. He is asking if there is cumin. Julian's professionalism was beginning to fray at the edges. Cumin? Absolutely not. Our chef would never use such a common spice in this dish. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, a small echo of the larger arrogance at the table. A quiet, frustrating impasse had been reached. Finch was watching the exchange with growing impatience, his billion-dollar deal being held hostage by a culinary debate. He was about to interject when Clara stepped forward. She moved past Julian, her steps so quiet and assured that no one thought to stop her. She came to a halt beside Sheikh Khalid's chair, placing herself in the dead space where the power of the room had failed. She took a small, steadying breath, the memory of her father's voice echoing in her mind. Then she looked directly at Sheikh Khalid, offering a small, respectful inclination of her head. She spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension in the room like a silver knife. She did not speak in English. The words that left her lips were flawless, formal Arabic, the dialect of the educated elite from the capital city of his homeland. She asked him, simply and clearly, if the taste he was detecting was perhaps fenugreek, as it was sometimes mistaken for cumin by a Western palate but carried a slightly more bitter, maple-like note. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The room didn't just fall silent. It ceased to exist. Forks stopped. Glasses were held motionless. The low hum of the ventilation system seemed to roar into the sudden, total vacuum of sound. Every single person at the table, from Alistair Finch to the lowest junior partner, turned and stared, their faces a collage of disbelief, at the waitress. For a long moment, Sheikh Khalid simply looked at Clara. The mask of polite indifference he had worn all evening dissolved, replaced by a look of profound and genuine astonishment. A slow smile, the first real expression of warmth he had shown, spread across his face, lighting up his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, a gesture of relaxation and ease that was in stark contrast to his earlier rigidity. He answered her in his own language, his voice, heard directly for the first time, a deep and melodic baritone that filled the silent room. He confirmed that it was indeed fenugreek, and he complimented her on a palate so discerning it could identify a single, subtle spice in a complex dish. A conversation began. It flowed between them effortlessly, a quiet stream of elegant, nuanced language in a room that had only known the blunt instrument of English business speak. Alastair Finch watched, his mouth slightly agape. He was no longer the master of this universe. He was an outsider, a confused and irrelevant spectator at his own party. The power he had so carefully cultivated had vanished, siphoned away by a 20-year-old in a black dress speaking a language he couldn't understand. "What is happening?" Finch demanded, his voice sharp and laced with panic. He looked at Julian, the manager, for an explanation, but Julian was as stunned as he was. He then turned to the translator. "What are they saying?" The translator, who had been listening with a look of awe on his face, started to speak, but before he could, Sheikh Khalid raised a hand. It was a simple, placid gesture, but it carried an undeniable authority. He did not look at Finch. His entire attention, his entire world in that moment, was focused on Clara. The gesture said, clearly and without words, "We are speaking. You will wait." The humiliation for Finch was total. He had been dismissed. In his own room, at his own table, he had been rendered powerless by his own guest and a member of the serving staff. The center of gravity in the Meridian suite had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer located at the head of the table where Finch sat, but in the small, charged space between the Sheikh and the waitress who had dared to see him as a person. The other men at the table stared, their own confidence beginning to crumble. They had followed Finch's lead, treated the Sheikh as a target, and now they were watching as their leader was sidelined by a quiet young woman who possessed a form of currency, respect, knowledge, humanity, that their host had fatally undervalued. The Sheikh's curiosity was piqued. Still speaking in his native tongue, he gently asked Clara how she had come to possess not only his language but such a deep, intuitive understanding of its cultural nuances. He noted that her accent was not that of a student who had learned from books, but of someone who had lived and breathed the air of his home. Clara's professional composure gave way to a quiet, personal dignity. She explained, her voice soft but steady, that her father had been a diplomat. He had served as the cultural attaché at the American Embassy in the Sheikh's capital city for nearly 15 years. She had grown up there, from the age of 3 until she was 18. His country was not a foreign land to her. It was the landscape of her childhood. She told him her father's name was Robert Vance. At the mention of that name, a light of recognition dawned in Sheikh Khalid's eyes, bright and clear. He leaned forward, his interest now intensely personal. He remembered Robert Vance. He remembered him well. He spoke of him with a reverence that stunned the silent onlookers, whose only clue to the conversation was the Sheikh's animated expression and the translator's astonished face. He described her father as a man of great wisdom and integrity, a rare diplomat who sought to understand rather than to influence. He called him a true friend, a builder of bridges. He recalled long evenings spent in her father's library, debating poetry and philosophy. He spoke of Robert Vance not as a foreign official, but as a kindred spirit. This conversation was no longer about a business deal or a misplaced spice. It had become a reunion of legacies. It was about a shared history, a connection forged years ago through mutual respect, a bond that transcended the sterile, transactional world of Alastair Finch. Clara was not just a waitress who happened to speak a foreign language. She was Robert Vance's daughter. She was the inheritor of a legacy of honor, a legacy the Sheikh valued far more than any algorithm or logistics platform. The revelation hung in the air, completely reframing the dynamics of the room. Clara's presence was no longer an accident of her employment. It felt like fate, a moral reckoning delivered in the quietest possible way. She had, without intending to, brought the spirit of her father into the room, and his values were now sitting in judgment of the shallow ambitions of the men at the table. The private conversation between Clara and the Sheikh concluded. Sheikh Khalid sat back, a thoughtful, almost sad smile on his face, as he contemplated the memory of his old friend. He then turned to his translator and instructed him, in a calm, measured tone, to explain everything to the table. The young translator, now looking at Clara with a mixture of shock and profound respect, cleared his throat. He began to relay the story, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. He told them of Clara's upbringing, of her father, Robert Vance, and of the deep esteem in which the Sheikh held his memory. He explained that their entire conversation had been about this shared history, a history of friendship and mutual admiration between two cultures. As the story unfolded, Alistair Finch's face became a canvas of crumbling arrogance. His initial confusion curdled into irritation, which then collapsed into a pale, dawning horror. The full scope of his miscalculation was finally settling upon him. He had not just been rude to a potential investor. He had been dismissive and blind in the presence of a legacy that his guest held sacred. He had failed the most important test of all, the test of character. Desperate to salvage the situation, to regain some semblance of control, Finch attempted to co-opt the moment. He forced a wide, artificial smile. "Well, isn't that just a remarkable story? A wonderful coincidence?" he boomed, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Robert Vance. Of course, the name is familiar. A great man, I've heard. What a fantastic connection to have right here at our table." The lie was pathetic, a desperate grasp at relevance. It was so transparently false that it was more embarrassing than his earlier ignorance. Sheikh Khalid turned his head slowly and gave Finch a long, cool, appraising look. He said nothing, but his eyes communicated everything. They saw the lie, they saw the panic, and they saw the hollow man behind the expensive suit. Finch's forced smile faltered, then vanished. He looked away, a faint flush of red creeping up his neck. His authority, which had once filled the room to its very corners, had now shrunk to the size of the chair he sat in. His partners, the men who had orbited him so eagerly just an hour before, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, studiously avoiding his gaze. They were embarrassed for him, and in the world of high-stakes business, pity was a death sentence. The king had been exposed as a fraud, and his court was quietly dissolving around him. Sheikh Khalid allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of Finch's failure settle over the room. When he finally spoke, he switched to perfect, unaccented English, his voice calm and decisive. The translator was no longer needed. This message was for everyone. "Mr. Finch," he began, his eyes fixed on the man at the head of the table. "Thank you for this dinner. It has been illuminating." The pause was deliberate. Each beat a nail in the coffin of the deal. "My fund seeks partners for the future. We believe the future must be built on a foundation of mutual respect, keen observation, and an understanding that the greatest assets are not listed on any stock exchange. We look for partners who value people over portfolios." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. "It has become clear that our values do not align. We will not be moving forward with this investment." The finality of the statement was absolute. There was no room for negotiation, no hope for appeal. In a few carefully chosen sentences, a billion-dollar deal had been vaporized. Finch sat as if turned to stone, his face a mask of disbelief. The professional ruin was swift, quiet, and total. But the Sheikh was not finished. He stood, his elegant robes giving him a stature that made the expensive suits around him look like cheap costumes. He turned his attention from the disgraced CEO to Clara. "Miss Vance," he said, the use of her surname a powerful act of recognition, of restoring her identity. "Your father was a great man. He understood that a conversation is more valuable than a contract. You have his spirit." He looked at her, standing there in her simple black uniform, and saw not a servant, but the keeper of a noble legacy. "A person of your talents, your insight, And your integrity is wasted in a place like this. He continued, his voice resonating with sincerity. My family's foundation runs an international cultural and educational exchange program. We fund the work of promising young scholars who wish to continue the work of building bridges between our worlds. I believe your father would be immensely proud to see you continue his life's work. He paused, then added, my chief of staff will be in contact with you tomorrow to discuss the details. Consider it a scholarship in Robert Vance's name. He gave her a slight, formal bow, a gesture of respect so profound in its context that it sealed the complete inversion of power in the room. He had not just rejected Finch, he had elevated Clara, offering her a future in the same breath that he had dismantled Finch's. With a final, polite nod to the stunned table, Sheikh Khalid and his small entourage turned and swept out of the Meridian suite. They left behind a silence thick with the ghosts of ambition and the stark reality of failure. Alistair Finch remained frozen at the head of the table, his hands resting on the polished mahogany as if to steady himself. The room, which had been his stage, his arena of triumph, was now the scene of his greatest humiliation. The expensive food grew cold on the plates. The Venetian chandelier seemed to mock him, its light now feeling harsh and interrogative. His partners, his so-called allies, began to quietly excuse themselves, mumbling about early flights and sudden headaches. They were rats deserting a sinking ship, leaving their captain alone with the wreckage. Julian, the manager, stood by the service station, his professional veneer completely gone, looking at Clara with an expression of pure astonishment. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time, and he could not reconcile the quiet waitress he had hired with the woman who had just altered the course of fortunes. Clara, however, felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The nervous energy had dissipated, replaced by a quiet strength. The black uniform no longer felt like a costume of invisibility. It was just clothing. Her worth was not defined by the fabric she wore or the plates she carried. She moved with a newfound purpose, beginning to clear the table, her actions methodical and serene. Each plate she lifted, each glass she collected, felt like a small act of closure. As she worked, she could feel Finch's eyes on her. He was watching her, the architect of his downfall, the ghost who had materialized to pass judgment. Finally, her tasks were done. The table was clear, save for the wilting centerpiece. She turned to leave. At the doorway of the Meridian suite, she paused and looked back one last time. Alistair Finch had not moved. He had sunk lower in his high-backed chair, a solitary king presiding over an empty kingdom, surrounded by the opulent trappings of a power that was no longer his. The image was a perfect, haunting mirror of the scene at the beginning of the evening, but the entire world had been turned upside down. Clara stepped out of the room, leaving the silence and the failure behind her. She walked down the long, carpeted hallway, not into the shadows of a life unseen, but towards the bright, unexpected promise of a future her father's legacy had just unlocked for her. The grand doors of Aurelia closed behind her, and the quietest voice in the room had finally, definitively, had the last word.